back, my fellow assassins, to another episode of the Dark Assassins podcast, the show that dives deep into not just technology, but the concepts, software, and procedures behind it all, and explains it so simply that even your grandma can understand it. As always, I'm your host, the Dark Assassin. So, before we get into this episode, I gotta wish all of you guys a very happy Thanksgiving. I hope you got to spend time with your family. I know I got plans to spend time with my family. I'm obviously recording this before Thanksgiving, if you can't tell. So I'm going to be spending some time with my family, which I'm definitely looking forward to. I hope you all got to spend some quality time with your families as well. And of course, because it's Thanksgiving, I hope you also got to enjoy some very good food. The turkey, the mashed potatoes, the gravy, the stuffing, the whole 9 yards. And obviously, it can't be Thanksgiving without pie. At least that's how it is at my family's house. We always have the saying, it's not Thanksgiving if you don't have pie, specifically pumpkin pie, although at my house we do enjoy large varieties of different kinds of pie because, who doesn't love pie, right? Even on the Dark Assassins podcast here, we talk about pie quite often. Although, in fairness, that is in the form of the Raspberry Pi, the computer, but still, it technically has pie in the name. I know I'm really making a stretch there, but nonetheless, everyone loves pie, I think. So, yeah, hopefully you got to spend some good time with your family, ate some good food, and with that, let's get into the episode. So, of course, we have to, because this is a short week, I don't necessarily have a ton of stuff to talk about, but as always, we're going to start this episode off with, what nerdy stuff have I been up to this week? So, but actually, I guess it's still technically part of this week, although just not as of the recording of this podcast. So, my goal is to actually run my backup script like I tried to do a couple weekends ago, like I mentioned in last episode, but I had the derp moment and forgot to plug my Xserve in. But don't worry, I made a note to myself before I leave to plug it in. So we'll see if I actually remember to plug it in, but I wrote it down, so I really have no excuse now. So hopefully, by the time you're listening to this, I would have successfully ran the backup script and hopefully it would have worked, but I will report back next week on that. As far as other things that I did, I mentioned a couple weeks ago when I was talking about Proxmox really doesn't like when you make configuration changes, especially when you have like a cluster of nodes together. So in that episode, I believe I talked about creating a new clean custom image for my Windows deployment system or service with the new Windows 22H2 update. Well, I finally got around to making that image after delays, but I did get around to making that image. I decided to, because I was going to make this new image, I might as well update my version of Windows Server, so I got that upgraded to Windows Server 2022, so that's upgraded. Of course, I had a backup saved of my old one, just in case something went horribly wrong. I would be able to restore from the backup and still have my Windows deployment service. So I got through that, ran through the whole process of installing it over the network, got it installed, installed some programs to the 22H2 version I was creating a clean image for, because basically what you're able to do is you basically take kind of like a snapshot, I guess you could say, of the Windows install, and then you can basically port that around as many times as you want. So this is basically how more or less how, companies and businesses install like their own versions of Windows onto their devices that have specific software installed. That's more or less the process they go through to get that set up. But as part of this process, there's some helpful scripts out there that you can use to completely de-bloat Windows, which is awesome. So it removes like all those ads for, like Candy Crush and Hulu and, all that stuff that like, why the heck are you giving this to me in my Windows operating system? I just want an operating system. I don't need your ads. So it gets rid of all that garbage, disables all the telemetry and spyware and spying stuff that Windows puts in. Very nice. Craft Computing did a video on creating your own custom Windows image, so if you're interested, go check out that video. But regardless, I got that done, and then once you get the image the way you want it, you run the thing called sysprep, which basically strips out all the device-specific information about your Windows install. So like any system identifiers, drivers, all that good stuff, it just strips it out so you can have a nice clean image that you can then go install on other machines. So after I did that, I booted back into the Windows deployment service, created the image, saved it, and then put it into my Windows deployment service. And then, because you got to test things, I went through the process of reinstalling that clean image that I just made, realized everything worked, and I was like, cool, good to go here. And then after I realized everything was good, then I made another backup of my Windows deployment service VM because I knew at this point everything's good. And if something were to happen in the future, I can roll back to this point, which I know is good. So if something happens between now and my next routine backup, we're covered. So that was probably the main things that I did. And then kind of as an aside here, other things that I did. One thing, we talked last episode about using the Windows command prompt even if it's disabled. And one thing that really annoys me about the Windows command prompt is the fact that commands for performing the same tasks are different between Windows and Mac OS and Linux. And it's really annoying to me. And you might be saying, well, why don't you just use Windows subsystem for Linux? Now, I can do that, and I have done that, but sometimes you don't have the option to do that, or sometimes you just want to use the command prompt. So I decided that, you know what, I am going to make my own commands, my Unix-style commands, if you will, so more macOS Linux-style commands. So basically what I did was I created numerous batch files, and batch files, I think I mentioned in last week's episode, are essentially just a script full of commands, essentially command prompt commands. So basically what I did was I would create a batch file, for example, called mv.bat. Or move.bat. So if you want to move a file on Windows, you don't type mv file and then where you want to move it, you have to type move. And that's annoying. I want to do mv because that's what I'm used to. So I created this mv.bat file, and then literally inside the bat file was literally just @echo off, which basically just means don't print anything to the screen when you run. Specifically, don't print the commands to the screen, since if you don't use that command echo off, basically what will happen is when you run the batch file, you'll get a new command line input for each line in the batch file, which is not exactly the cleanest solution. So pretty much every batch file you'll see has echo off at the very top, which basically turns that off. And then literally it's just that, and then it's move space %*. And literally all that means is every command line argument that was passed in, send that to the move command, and that's it. And then I basically did the same thing for other commands like the ls command, because Windows used dir, the rm command, which was really annoying to implement because in Windows, you can't use, there's no like universal remove thing like there is in macOS and Linux. Like on macOS and Linux, you can type rm to delete files, and then if you want to delete folders and stuff, you can do rmrf, which is like remove recursive force essentially, which can be very bad if you're not careful. But it's, I don't know if I should necessarily admit this, but it's kind of my go-to when I'm trying to remove stuff, which probably isn't the best idea for things, but, gets the job done, right? Now, I'm not going to say that I have unintentionally removed stuff with that command, but yeah, anyway, so because in Windows there is no such command like that, I had to essentially figure out if the file or if the argument passed in that I'm dealing with is a folder or just a regular file, and then from there determine if I need to delete it or not. So there was another one. Another one that I made was the touch command. So if you're not familiar on Linux and macOS and other Unix-based systems, if you want to just create a file from the command line, but you don't want to put anything in it, you just want to make a file, you can run the touch command, which is touch, and then whatever the file name's going to be, and that'll create the file. But in Windows, you have to do this weird, like, there's a couple different ways you can do it. You can do, like, type, I think it's type, null, and then, like, pipe that to the file you want to create, which is kind of annoying. So what I did was I created a batch file that basically does that, and then, whatever file you passed in. And then I also had it configured so you could pass in multiple files, names of multiple files, and it would create all of those for you. So that was cool. So yeah, just basically making my Windows command prompt life more enjoyable, I guess, because, I could obviously do other things like, as mentioned, Windows subsystem for Linux, or, other various Unix-ish shells for Windows like Cygwin or Git Bash or things like that. But no, I gotta be difficult. Plus, then I get to talk about it here of, nerdy things I did, because who in their right mind would create a bunch of batch files to simulate a Mac OS Linux type shell on Windows? I mean, who does that, right? Oh, wait, I do. So now let's actually get into the main topic of today's episode. So I want to, the main portion of this topic, I gotta start off with a little bit of a story time. So back in the end of October, I, as well as my fellow compatriots that are currently being subjected to the blatant violation of the 8th Amendment of the United States Constitution, which, if you're not aware, that is cruel and unusual punishment, being afflicted upon us by colleges and universities in the form of graduate and undergraduate programs, we took midterms. So in case you're unaware or can't tell, I'm not exactly the biggest fan of school. But hyperbole aside, of course, the midterm that I took in this case was 6 essay questions, which loads of fun. I became a computer scientist, and partly because, went that degree path, partly because I didn't like writing essays and reading textbooks. Yet pretty much all I've done in grad school is write essays and read textbooks. Where did I go so wrong? I don't know. But anyway, back to the story here. So the exam was, I will say one nice thing about this, I guess, if there is even a nice thing to say about this exam, it was like open book, open note, all that, whatever. But the nice thing was we had 24 hours to take it, and it didn't have to be like all in one sitting, which was also pretty nice. So basically what the professor did was, like, I think it was Sunday night, he sent out the exam. I think it was around like 6 o'clock in the evening. And then we had basically till 6 o'clock the next day evening to, complete it, write our answers down and submit it to him. So I would say I was kind of ballparking my time at around 7.5-ish hours or so. Obviously that wasn't all in one sitting because I would have gone insane, kind of did, but it is what it is. But part of the reason why it took me that long was because like I said, I went to computer science to avoid writing essays. Part of the reason is I cannot spell or do grammar to save my life. If you've ever seen any of my writing before, it can be pretty bad. And usually if it's not bad, that's because I at least try to do a good amount of proofreading or through some like online grammar checker or something. And even then I'll still miss stuff, and it's not good. So a decent chunk of that was proofreading. But I guess the breakdown would be about like an hour-ish per question, with like some very basic proofreading once I finished writing the essay, and then an additional hour and a half like at the very end, just kind of proofreading everything. So yeah, 7.5 hours, and not gonna lie, that was probably like collectively, the amount of time that I spent on that midterm, 7.5 hours, was probably 3 times more time that I spent on that class up until the midterm. So essentially I didn't really spend any time on the class up until the midterm. Now, I hear what you're saying. That is very irresponsible of you. Why would you completely blow off your class like that? Because, obviously that's not smart, because you're going to bomb the midterm. And, I can hear so many complaints. And I would kindly direct all those complaints and criticisms and all that stuff to the 100% that I got on the midterm. Now, obviously, I am not trying to gloat about this because, as I've mentioned many times on this podcast, I don't care. 1, I don't care about school. 2, I don't think it makes you smart. And test scores literally mean nothing, in my opinion. I'm more project-oriented. I think if you can create a project, that is a lot more impressive to me than a 100% on some random midterm exam, in my opinion. But one thing I will mention is I was very keen, I don't know if you caught this, but throughout that entire story, I was very keen to leave out some very important information from you. Specifically, what the class was and what the exam was on. And once I inform you of those things, you'll really start to see why I didn't really spend much time on the class and did so well. So the name of this class is called Architectural Support for Cloud Computing. So that might start, lighten up a few things in your mind, like, because I am also the guy that essentially runs his own cloud operation at his house. So, yeah. And what was the exam on, you might ask? Well, cloud computing stuff like virtualization, RAID arrays, redundancy, availability, just stuff that I do pretty much deal with every single day when I'm tinkering around in my home lab. So excuse me for not feeling the need to read a textbook about how RAID works when I literally deal with it every day. or excuse me for not feeling the need to read a textbook about virtualization and how VMs work when I'm literally spinning them up and down on a regular basis. So yeah, I kind of had a feeling like I knew what was going on. And pretty much the whole time I checked into this class was mainly just to see what the topics were. And like, I know that. Yep. All right, go. Cool. That's it. And the main reason I didn't spend more on this class is because there was no other assignments. Now, another thing I should also point out is I am currently in a second class too. I know I really hate myself. But the second class that I'm in, I am easily spending a few hours on every single week because there's weekly activities that are due, and there's homework assignments, and there's a course project, and there's a bunch of stuff like actually involved in this class. So like I actually have to do work for it, and I actually do work for it and put in the effort. So I'm not blowing off school just for the sake of blowing off school. I'm blowing off school because I don't feel like boring myself to death reading information that I already know. For me, that just seems like a waste of time. And as my midterm exam showed, I didn't need it. But again, I'm not trying to gloat here. All I'm trying to do is demonstrate why having a home lab and doing personal programming projects and all that stuff can actually make real-world impacts. Because we've mentioned before on this podcast that, some hypothetical situations that, oh yeah, I can help you, find jobs and all this stuff. But this is some like legit real-world scenarios where, because I have a home lab and deal with this stuff daily for fun, it made it so that I really didn't have to do any work in this class and still was able to succeed. So another thing that I would like to point you to for those that are maybe in undergrad and actually get to program in their computer science degree, which I kind of envy you, because as much as I hate school, one thing that wasn't completely terrible when I was in undergrad was the fact that basically almost all of my computer science class were at least programming based and not, reading textbook based. But anyway, so if you're, say, in undergrad and you're pursuing a computer science degree, and let's say that you program in Java for fun. You do it in your free time, you make your own projects, you write your own programs, and you just, have fun with Java. And the class you're taking this semester is a Basics of Java class. Now, one thing I want to ask you is if you program in Java on the reg, as the cool kids say, because we're cool here, if you program in Java regularly, are you going to read the textbook about how classes work, how inheritance work, how loops work, and how variables work, and all that jazz? Of course you're not, because you already know that stuff. You're not going to waste your time. Rather than reading the textbook on how to do it, you're going to just, work on your, personal fun project that you actually enjoy doing, rather than boring yourself to sleep. Well, actually, that is a good point, boring yourself to sleep. If you do have trouble sleeping, might as well pick up a textbook and start reading that thing, because you will be out in no time. I'm not a doctor, so I obviously, can't take that as medical advice, unfortunately. But if you're really having trouble sleeping, maybe that's when you want to bust out your textbook and start reading, because man, are those things boring. Even if it's a topic you enjoy, man, are they boring. But the reason why I bring this up is because you don't need to read the textbook when you have legit experience on it, right? And the reason why I brought up this whole Java example here is because this was actually me in undergrad. I had a class where it was an intro to Java class. And at this point, at the time I took the class, I had been programming in Java for, I don't remember how long it was. It was at least 2.5 or 3 years at that point but at the time I took the class. And honestly, one of the only reasons that I showed up to that class was because for whatever reason, my professor didn't make the labs that were, obviously required and part of the grade. They didn't provide the labs like online on Canvas, which was, the thing that they were using for, grades and, posting, assignments and some other things. But they never posted the labs on Canvas. So the only way you could get the labs was if you showed up to class. But the other problem was some days, it was a Tuesday-Thursday class. So some days you would get a lab on Tuesday. Sometimes you wouldn't. Sometimes you'd get a lab on Thursday. Sometimes you wouldn't. Sometimes you'd get a lab on both days. Sometimes you wouldn't get a lab at all that week. So unless you showed up to every single class, you wouldn't get the labs. And as your stereotypical computer science student, I just sat in class, didn't talk to anyone, and then went right back to my dorm room. So it's not like I could ask someone for the lab. So I actually had to show up to class. Now, when I showed up to class, I didn't really pay attention that much because, quite honestly, I didn't need to. But also, somehow, some way, this professor that I had managed to confuse me. Someone that had been programming in Java for 2.5 to 3 years, making their own personal projects in their free time and doing a large amount of Java programming, they managed to confuse me on the basics of how Java works. Now explain that to me, right? Like, all I gotta say is real world experience can definitely trump a classroom environment all day, every day. So yeah, and another great example of this was, I don't remember if it was a lab or if it was like an actual like project, but they gave us an assignment and it was to do with graphics, which, mind you, I'm terrible with graphics. But I was trying to be a good student, right? I was trying to be good and follow their instructions on what they wanted me to do. And I kid you not, I was beating my head against the wall for over an hour trying to figure out, one, what they wanted me to do, and two, how to get it to work. And I couldn't figure out any of it. And then after about an hour of essentially getting nowhere, I basically said, you know what? To heck with this. I'm doing it my way. What is the end result? And I'm just going to do it my way. And within like 15, 20 minutes, program was done. Yeah. So again, this comes back to how real world experience, whether that's doing personal programming projects, having a home lab, making virtual machines, whatever the case is, it's going to help you in life, whether that's in school, whether that's in industry, wherever. This isn't just like, this isn't, school theoretical stuff. This is real world stuff. Like, these are actual things that can help you. This isn't like, conceptually, if you have a home lab, it can help you in life. Or conceptually, if you, write your own personal programs and learn coding on your own, conceptually, it theoretically could help you. No, these are like actual legit examples of how doing this stuff in your free time because you enjoy doing it and have a drive to learn it can actually make your life easier in the real world. And this is specifically for the schooling environment. But obviously you can, tailor it towards the professional environment as well. Whether that's you want to, pursue a career as like a DevOps engineer. Well, what do DevOps engineers do? They do automation stuff, they do programming, they do infrastructure management, networking, all this stuff. you know what that kind of sounds like? That kind of sounds like, to me, doing your own personal projects and having a home lab. Interesting. So, yeah, the big point, I guess, for this episode was I really wanted to give you guys some real-world examples of how, for me personally, doing personal projects and coding in my spare time and having a home lab and, tinkering around with all this stuff has actually helped me in life. Specifically, allowing me to not have to put in effort into school, which I hate very, very much. So hopefully for any of you out there that are on the slog as I am and are being subjected to the blatant violation of the 8th Amendment of the United States Constitution, like I mentioned before, the cruel and unusual punishment being put through by these colleges and universities to go through school. One thing that will definitely make your life easier is, doing this kind of stuff for fun in your free time. Because if you can find something that you actually enjoy doing rather than something that you're forced to do because it'll quote unquote help you learn, which I one thing I guess I will say is I know some people can actually learn by reading textbooks and stuff, and I don't know how they do it. And if that's you, I kind of envy you because I can't learn that way, but some people can. But, if you can actually find ways to learn, in this industry, in this field, find projects that you're actually interested in, that's going to help you tremendously, because whether it's a undergrad degree and you're doing a lot of programming, whether that's a conceptual garbage textbook concept environment that grad school is, and you need to know terms and all that stuff, if you deal with this stuff on a daily basis, in my example for the grad school stuff, dealing with virtualization, dealing with migrating VMs around, dealing with hypervisors, dealing with, RAID arrays, dealing with all this infrastructure stuff, it makes it a lot easier when they ask you, hey, how does virtualization work? It's like, well, let me tell you. And no, I didn't read your textbook. So it can really make your life a lot more enjoyable, actually, in my opinion. Because honestly, in my opinion, the less school, the better. So if I can mess around and tinker and break stuff in my home lab for as much time as I spend doing that, rather than having to sit at a computer falling asleep at my desk trying not to want to kill myself reading this textbook, I'm going to take that every day of the week. And the same thing goes for programming too. When I was an undergrad, I had, for some reason, there was actually I actually had to have textbooks for programming, which is kind of funny because that textbook's going to be outdated in 2 seconds, because programming languages, there's new versions, Python specifically, there's a new Python version, I don't know, every few months, something like that. So trying to get a textbook on Python, well, that thing's going to be outdated before the class is even over. And I think the only time that I actually opened one of those textbooks was when I was forced to actually look at the practice problems because they were assigned for homework. I never read one of those textbooks as far as learning how to program. I didn't use one of those textbooks to learn how to use a for loop. I didn't use one of those textbooks to learn how classes work. I didn't use one of those textbooks to know how to write an SQL database query, because there's this thing called the internet, which I can use that I can input my queries in there. And if I have an issue, I can just say, how do I do XYZ in B language? Or how do I do this in this language? Rather than, okay, let me look through this textbook here and let me find examples. And sorry, I fell asleep there. Let me try to find, and I fell asleep again. So now, like I said, if you can read textbooks and understand things and learn things, and that's how you learn, by all means, do that, and I encourage that. And I am honestly very jealous of your ability, because it would have made my life, and would make my life a heck of a lot easier. But for me, textbooks are not the move. So like I mentioned a couple episodes ago, this whole archaic version that, colleges and universities perpetuate learning, through textbooks and all that stuff. No. I mean, some degrees and, some like degrees in work and lines of education, I guess you can kind of justify it. But computer science and cybersecurity and anything like IT related, no. Because you get the textbook, right? And yeah, maybe it's relevant for when you take the course. But then, like I mentioned with the whole Python example, that thing's outdated before you're done with the course. And by the time you actually graduate from your degree, that textbook's probably going to be outdated anyway. So you can't exactly go back and reference it. So, I don't remember where I heard it, but I do remember hearing, like, if you go to school for, like, a computer science degree or something, like, by the time you graduate, all your knowledge is outdated because how quickly the field's moving. But if you're constantly doing your personal programming projects and you have a home lab and can keep up with these latest trends and play around with this stuff, your knowledge isn't outdated now, is it? Because you can stay on top of things. This was a very, I guess, kind of more of a ranty episode rather than like an educational episode. But I mean, this is me we're talking about. Any chance I can get to bash higher education and bash school when I can say do this instead because it's better, I'm obviously going to take that, right? I mean, you guys know me at this point. I'm going to take that all day. But yeah, when it really boils down to it, the main reason I wanted to talk about this is because I've mentioned before a lot on this podcast about, like, yeah, if you can, work on personal projects or have a home lab, it can help you in life, right? And I wanted to actually provide some real world examples. Yeah, sure, it's anecdotal, but at the same time, like, I know I'm not alone on this, right? You can go out on the internet and find tons of examples of people doing the same thing, and a lot of people recommend you do the same thing. And I just wanted to say that, like, this isn't just something that we say to say it, right? It's not something like, in the conceptual world, like, yeah, this is how something works, and because it works, and it works like this because that's how it works, right? We're actually demonstrating to you in this case that, yes, it does work, and see, here's an example of it actually working. Because, at the end of the day, when it comes down to it, the whole point of, working on personal projects and having a home lab is getting out of the world of conceptual and theory. Like, yeah, sure, you can know how something conceptually works, but if you don't actually know how it works in practice and get your hands dirty in it, do you really know how it works? I would argue possibly not. And on that subject, one confession that I have to make is recently I've been trying to figure out a way to get myself into VLANing and doing VLANs. Now, I've talked on this podcast before about what VLANs are and how they work, but here is actually an example of how I'm admitting to you that I personally, based on my definition of just because you know the theory and the concept of how it works, if you don't know how to like implement and actually use it, do you really know how it works? And personally, I was trying to play around with VLANs a week or two ago, and it absolutely kicked my butt and I couldn't figure it out. So based off that, I actually don't know how they work, even though in theory I know how they work in theory, but I haven't been able to successfully implement them. So it kind of goes back to that whole thing, like, back to my college class when we were talking about RAID and virtualization and availability and all that stuff. Like, yeah, sure, they're teaching us about how these concepts work, but does anyone actually know how they work, because they don't actually have to deal with them and use them? Like, in my case, I actually do know how they work because I'm, using them and dealing with them, maybe not every day, but at least on a very regular basis. So yeah, and the reason why I didn't bring up the VLAN thing was because, like, not only did it kind of kick my butt, but I didn't spend enough time with it to really understand why it was kicking my butt. Like, I didn't really understand what I was doing wrong and how to potentially fix it. And when I want to, bring up that kind of stuff of nerdy things that I do, usually if I break something, like I've mentioned many times on this podcast of things that I've broken, I at least have theories or explanations or insights into why they broke, and possibly how I went about fixing it. But this was more of like work in progress development. I'm not quite there yet. So yeah, technically, based on my own definition, I am a walking hypocrite, because I talk about how VLANs work in theory, this whole like segmenting of your network and making it more secure and all that stuff. But I haven't actually implemented it and never actually, got it to work in practice. So obviously, because even though I got a 100 on my exam, I'm obviously not that smart, because as you can see, and as I've mentioned many times on this podcast, I do some very derp things from time to time and mess up pretty good. But that's the whole point of the learning experience, right? It's not about, in theory what you know, but in practice what you know. So this was a very, very rambly episode. But if you enjoyed this episode, I would ask that you leave it a rating and review, and subscribe to the Dark Assassins podcast if you haven't done so already. And also be sure to share with a friend or family member, maybe someone that doesn't necessarily fully buy in to the fact that if you do, outside work like a home lab or personal programming projects or whatever the case may be, they don't quite buy into the fact that that can actually help you in your life and in your career and in your education and all that stuff. Maybe you could send this to them and they can see that, yes, it actually does help you, and some, evidence as to why that is. Now, if you have any questions about this episode, or you have any questions for topics that you want me to address in a future episode, send me an email at contact@darkassassinsinc.com. There's a link for that down in the show notes that you can click. And that's going to do it for me in this episode of the Dark Assassins podcast. Until next time, my fellow assassins, remember, fool nothing equals true. If action not equal to null, return true. I'll see you next time on the Dark Assassins podcast.